But I think there's two issues here. There's one is what was the policy response in the immediate aftermath of the crisis.
Yep.
And then there's this larger issue about what might be described as systemic, real economic issues in this country that I would argue were actually masked for a very long time by debt, which led to the crisis.
I've actually made that argument, so we're together.
So why have we not spent enough time on those issues?
Because Washington works for the wealthy and the well-connected, not for working families. I mean, that's how it is.
So but part of the question embedded in that question is when you think about globalization taking jobs, and we can talk about trade, and I want to talk about trade with you. And when you think about stagnating wages, and when you think about the number of workers that weren't in the workforce, when you look at the policies in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, had people been allowed to do principal reduction or some of the other things you talked about,
and held on to their homes,
do you think it would have worked? Because and by the way, there's lots of debate about whether it would have worked because if people didn't have jobs, they wouldn't have ultimately been able to pay the mortgage that they would have had to pay later. Would it have worked? And B, where would we be today instead? That's what I'm very curious about.
So, look, the answer is yes, I think it would have worked, and I think we would have a stronger working class, middle class in America right now, and more opportunity for those who are trying to make it into the middle class. But I think the real picture, and I think this is actually what you were driving at a second ago, I think it's a larger push across this. So can we do this? So start with 1790s.
Okay. We've only got 50 minutes, but yes.
That's okay. I figure a decade a minute, we can make it through this. Okay, so start in the 1790s, first big crash for this new country. And basically, roughly every about 15 years, right? What happens is the economy gets better, the economy gets better, the economy gets better, the economy gets great, and then bang, the economy crashes. And the problem, of course, is that when it crashes, it doesn't just take down the speculators. It takes down the farmers, and it takes down the small shopkeepers, and it takes down employees. It takes down a lot of people who didn't get wealthy on the climb, but sure end up in the ditch when it all goes down. There were many people in the United States and around the world who believed that cycle in an economy was it was like gravity, right? You pick this thing up and drop it, it's going to fall. It takes 15 years, but roughly 10 to 20, but that's what's going to happen. The big one hits in the 1930s, and Franklin Roosevelt says, we can do better than this. And then he does these incredibly bold things. So he says, we'll make it safe to put money in banks, right? FDIC insurance. We'll put a watchdog on Wall Street, the SEC. We will break up the big financial institutions, Glass-Steagall, right? And we will enforce antitrust laws much more vigorously than we have. So what happens? 1935 to 1980. Oh, by the way, let me throw in one more thing. And we'll do really progressive income tax and make the investments then in education, in infrastructure, in basic research. 1935 to 1980, you want to dance the GDP? Right? It does that, right? It does that. But here's the deal. Everybody not in the top 10%, the 90% of America, they get 70% of all that new income growth. That is when America builds the great middle class. Labor is strong, unions are growing, it's happening. Right. 1980, pivot point. What happens in 1980, right? So we see a shift, right? And what happens? The first part is deregulate. So they still leave FDIC insurance in place, fire the cops, not the cops on Main Street, the cops on Wall Street, right? Start pecking holes in Glass-Steagall till you knock it down at the end of the 90s. Pull in the regulators, way dial down on antitrust enforcement, and what happens? GDP keeps going right on up. It did